here's what's interesting to me. Here's a guy, as we have said, only painted 10 years, is famous for what he did in the last 3 years of his life, but didn't start until he was 27 years old. Son of a preacher. Did he have skills? Did he have, obviously he had potential. What do we see when we take him to his first paintings? What's in this painting? What does it tell us? Why is it important? Other than it's the first painting.
I think the answer is potential is the word you used. This is an artist who's learning how to paint. But at the same time, you can see threads of interest which he's going to take right the way through his career. This is painted in a storm. We know from the meteorological records, we know precisely when he did it, and we know what the weather was, we know what a force of a gale that it was. And he stood there on the beach, and he painted this picture. And in fact, the wind lashing in his face was too strong. He had to then go back to a cafe and finish it off. There's sand embedded on the surface of this picture, which blown up there by this wind. So straight away, you have an artist who's looking for extremes in nature. We've talked about the emotion of this artist. He's looking for a vehicle to express those emotions. That's one point. I think the other thing is this is Van Gogh working on the beach near The Hague in Holland. Van Gogh's a Dutch painter. He's born in Holland. And like so many Dutch painters, you have that tremendous sense of the force of nature. You could relate this picture to centuries of Dutch seascape painting, but with the boats and the figures and so on. But here, those figures, they're tiny. They're pitted against this storm. That boat doesn't look like one of those confident Dutch craft which we're
want
used
to
to
be
seeing.
on right now, is it?
Yeah, and there is this sense that what are they doing? Are they perhaps going to try and assist the people in that boat? There is a sense of activity. It's all bound up with this that stormy sky, the whole event of the wind and the rain and so on.
Before we go look at the cottage, which is across the gallery here, what is the primary influence on his life, on his work at this point? Has he been to art school?
He has been working with some Dutch artists. He's distantly related to quite an accomplished Dutch artist called Anton Mauve, who he's working with in The Hague at this time. And he's studying works by the Hague School, which was an important movement in the 19th century in Holland. And these were artists who knew about French painting and who knew of the more recent developments in French art. But yes, he's still here a provincial painter.
All right, let's take a look at the cottage. When we go see that, we'll see a different point of view from him?
We're jumping quite a few years, and in a way from one of the first hesitant exercises, although it's a great painting, you're going to see Van Gogh really after with quite a few paintings under his belt and becoming a more accomplished artist.
Let's take a look. It's 3 years later. This is the cottage. He's still living with his parents. He's still in Holland. What do we see different now? What's the evolution?
Well, it's a more accomplished painting. It's first of all, this is larger than many of the other pictures, apart from the potato eaters that he produces in this year. So he's thinking about doing more monumental pieces. Also, I think he's more focused now about the type of art and the type of subject. This is a peasant subject. You would think, straight away, you would think that this is going to be a picturesque painting. If I just described it to you without seeing the picture, you'd say, oh, there's a cottage and there's a thatched roof and there's a little lady in it and there's some trees behind. And you'd think, oh, that sounds nice. Then you look at this picture, it is grim, it is bleak.
I mean, the only thing you see is a little bit of light there, but everything else has a little fire in there. But the thatched roof, it's all dark.
Look at that interior. You have this idea of the picturesque cottage, this nice rustic ideal. I don't want to go inside that cottage. So that's dark, that's black, that's full of smoke. And I think that's one of the important things about Van Gogh's paintings of the peasants. He really isn't idealizing peasant life at all. He wants to paint it as it is.
And in fact, he makes statements in letters to his brother, Theo, who's in Paris, that he wants to make sure that he doesn't do that.
Yes.
That he wants to capture what he thinks is the essence and the beauty, if there is, of their life, which is the grimness of it.
Yes, you have an artist who is identifying very strongly with his subject. When he was in Belgium working as an evangelist, he had tried to live the same life as the people amongst whom he was preaching. And now as an artist, he was, when he was staying in his parents' house, he was dressing up as a peasant and acting a peasant life. In a way, much to the distress of his family, because they were a respectable middle-class family. I mean, his father was the pastor. He didn't want to have his son dressing up in these old clothes. As Van Gogh once said, for my parents, I'm like a scruffy dog in the house.
Yes. How much time between this painting, The Cottage, May 1885, and The Potato Eaters, which is the first painting that people began to see?
This is
Genius.
probably painted just in the aftermath of the Potato Eaters. So it's one of a whole series of rather confident pictures which come in the months after the Potato Eaters. And in that sense, you could probably describe the Potato Eaters as a bit of a breakthrough picture. He's done this monumental piece, and having got that out of the way, he can move on. And there is that sense of confidence here which comes in after that period.
All right, let's take a look at the Potato Eaters, which we'll see right over here in the next room. Here we are, the Potato Eaters, April 1885. He says in a letter to Theo, I would be wrong, I think, to give a peasant picture a certain conventional smoothness. If a peasant picture smells of bacon, smoke, potato steam, all right, that's not unhealthy. What's going on in his head?
Well, I suppose in one way, peasants are real people. They're the people who live off the land. They're the people who are closest to nature. And like so many artists in the 19th century, Van Gogh is setting that up in opposition to the artificiality of the city life, to the artificiality of bourgeois conventions. He's saying, oh, these are the real people. These are the salt of the earth, if you like. But he takes that really a stage further than any other artist of the 19th century. And this is still it's a frightening picture, actually. Those faces are so ugly. The way that he paints them is, in a way, so crude, so almost close to caricature, in a way, that you read the quote about not glossing over or smoothing over. This is the absolute opposite
going to the extreme
of that. This is a rough, tough, scary picture.
Was it recognized, as it is now, as the beginning of his achievements as a painter?
No, not at all. In fact, Vincent was very proud of this picture. He'd worked very hard on it. He'd made lots of studies. He'd assembled those studies into this composition. We can look at it now almost in a sneering way and say, gosh, it's a bit contrived, isn't it? And lots of things don't seem to work, such as that figure with her back to us, blocking out the main focus of the composition. That hand there on the coffee pot, which doesn't seem to be actually holding the handle. You can point to that and say, okay, there are these crudities in it. But no, it wasn't recognized because people did just what I've done now. For example, one of his close artist friends, Anton van Rappa, said, yeah, this is not a good picture. And Vincent was so offended by this remark that he broke off the friendship. He was very sensitive to criticism of this work. He wanted to show it, he wanted to exhibit it, he wanted it to be an important exhibition piece, but of course it could never have been. This could never have made his reputation at a huge exhibition in Paris. And it remained in the artist's family.
For, at least with Van Gogh, he thought about these paintings and he thought about the composition. This wasn't a passionate outburst for him. He wanted to capture something, but he planned it carefully.
I think that's a very important point because often people have this image of this wholly intuitive artist creating works on the spur of the moment in this kind of frenzy of creativity. But of course, he was a very careful painter in many ways. He did plan his compositions. He often used drawings. Sometimes even when there aren't separate drawings, there is a drawing underneath the painting itself. And in this case, as we said, he worked for months putting together the information for this picture, doing as many as 40 individual studies of peasants' heads, and then gradually piecing together this really quite complicated composition.
No evidence yet of what we will see in Paris. Paris changed everything for Van Gogh.
Yes, that's the period when he was most exposed to an array of different influences in modern art.
And he met other artists who were...
Yeah, and he's coming into contact with a whole range of avant-garde artists who have a lot to offer him.
What does he think of himself at this period?
He's usually, and I think this runs through his entire career, he's usually fairly modest about his own achievements, his own ambitions. But around about now, he's beginning to say, I think I have the makings of a painter in me. And there are some, of course, quite nice quotes at this time, for example, when he talks about painting being in his blood, in his flesh. And so I think however much he might be modest about his talents in comparison to other artists, I think by now he's certainly sure that he wants to be a painter above all else.
All right, let's take him to Paris in the next gallery. He's in Paris. He writes his brother, Theo, and says, I'm in Paris. I'll be at the Louvre. No notice, nothing.
Been talking about coming to Paris for some time, and I think for Theo, he was partly encouraging, partly discouraging. He was Theo, his brother in Paris, trying to build up his career as an art dealer in this whole world of the artistic world in Paris. I don't think Theo was quite convinced that he was ready to have his unruly older brother on the scene just yet. But Vincent, he couldn't wait in a way, because he'd been hearing from Theo about things that were going on. He'd been hearing about the work of the Impressionists. He wanted to see it. He wanted to see it for himself.
And be a part of it.
And try and be a part of it, yeah.
He says in one of his letters on June 3rd, 1890, I should like to do portraits which would appear as revelations to people in 100 years' time. What we see in this room, self-portraits. This is self-portrait as an artist, winter 1887, 1888. What do you see?
Well, I think this is a picture where Van Gogh is saying, take me seriously as an artist. A lot of the works we've been looking at to date are in a way exercises, studies. He's trying things out. This is a serious painting. And when you look closely at it, you can see how hard he has worked to build up those paint surfaces. In a way, he's almost tried too hard, and it's become, in a sense, almost contrived. Look at the amount of marks that there are in that face. He's really drawing with that paint. There are some beautiful passages. I mean, I think the way that he's captured that palette, there's a lovely double take in a way, painting a palette with paint on a palette in an artist's picture. The little holders for the turpentine, all that's beautifully captured. Yet the image that he projects here is, there's something quite constrained about it. It's a serious artist's portrait in a tradition of self-portraiture that goes back hundreds of years. But yeah, it doesn't quite have the life and the vitality of some of the other images, and he recognized that himself. He said himself that he'd gone too far.
He wanted most of all at this stage in his life to be a portrait painter.
That's an ambition that he carried right the way through. Above all else, he wanted to paint portraits. And of course, like so many younger artists, had difficulty finding people to pose for him, and difficulty finding people to take him seriously enough. He would have loved people to have commissioned him to do portraits, but of course, for obvious reasons, there weren't many of those around. So, like so many other artists before him, he turned back on his own image as the alternative. And in a whole range of self-portraits, he projects himself in different ways.
Of all the self-portraits, which is the best? Is there conventional wisdom about that?
I don't think there is a conventional wisdom, and I think there are ones which are better known than others, and I think this is clearly the standard image of Van Gogh as a painter.
If you were going to go out and advertise for Van Gogh, this would be one of the things that you would use.
This is the one you would use, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it has so many of the elements that we associate with him. It's not just the studied, serious expression, but the colour too. That combination of blue and orange. We have a lovely description of Van Gogh by one of his fellow artists at this time, who says, he describes him as turning round, hissing over his shoulder through gritted teeth, bleu-orange. Yes. And it was almost as if he's associated with this combination already.
Help us understand how he's come to appreciate color and how he uses color.
I think partly it's the revelation of things that are going on in Paris at the time. His idea of colour until he went to Paris was based very much on what he knew either from books, from reading about it, or from seeing, for example, paintings by old masters in the museums in Holland, or he'd of course been to London. But in Paris, when he came here in 1886, he was really exposed for the first time to some of the most exciting things that were going on in the avant-garde. And that's not just the Impressionists, but it's artists like Seurat, for example.
The strokes.
Yeah. He's here using those small touches of paint, which one associates, first of all, with Impressionism, but also with artists like Seurat and the Neo-Impressionists.
And the next room, we will begin to see what?
We'll see more of the experiments in Paris, and I think that's the essential point about the 2 years that he stayed in the capital. He tried a bit of everything. It's like somebody who only had one suit suddenly going into the department store and trying everything on. He tries a bit of everything, and it's a real melting pot.
All right, let's take a look at that right over here. So here we are. These are the gardens that Montmartre painted, 1887. He's still in Paris, but this is a landscape. It's more horizontal. What else do we see?
Well, it's in a way, it's rather like a Dutch landscape transferred into Paris, isn't it? With those windmills perched up there.
Now, what does that say?
Well, maybe he's homesick. I think the main thing here is we've been looking at these rather dark, somber pictures from the earlier period. Now, this, I think, shows you what a revelation Paris was in terms of the light and the colour of artists like the Impressionists. It's almost like somebody has opened a blind and that light's come flooding in. And look at
it will never again be the same.
No, look at the brightness of this picture. As we half close our eyes when we look at it, the whole thing is flooded with light. And you can see when you move in, you can see how he's also using quite a lot of different types of brushstroke to convey the different textures, the different surfaces. There's little dots along here, little dashes here, little strokes there. And whereas before, a peasant was that big heavy form with the canaled fingers and so on. Here the figures are dainty little fingers made out of little dots, and he's got to have been looking at an artist like Seurat when he was painting this.
Do you see any other influence from any other artist that he might have known in Paris in this landscape?
Well, in a way, it's almost like an encyclopedia of influences. I mean, we can see a little bit of Monet there, and one thinks of Monet had worked in Holland too, and one thinks of Monet's windmills straight away. One thinks of Pissarro, the Impressionist painter Pissarro, who had painted peasants working away in situations just like this. One thinks of artists like Signac, who Van Gogh knew at this time, in the way that the colour is all divided up. And we've just talked about Seurat. So, as I say, it's a whole range of different people. This is quite a complicated subject if you think about it. He's painting the view of the paths going up a hill.
Yeah, exactly. So
you've got this double effect of the perspective, and that's very tricky to get across. And in a way, it works, and it partly works. But to help him with that complicated perspective, he used this frame which he planted in 2 poles in the ground, and he looked through the frame, which had these lines, threads drawn across it. And it was like drawing through a window, and it enabled him to transfer the design onto the picture.
I'm struck also, perhaps this is insignificant, what is happening here, half of this painting, this horizontal canvas, is sky.
Yes.
He's got this all on the lower half, except for the windmill of the painting.
Yes, it's perhaps in that sense it's more conventional than many of the compositions we'll look at in a moment, and perhaps less striking in its design. But that sky, that very bright sky, has become a kind of a neutral field for all this busyness, for all this activity, for all this exploring around with little dots and dashes and that sort of Morse code of painting.
We have not yet seen, though, and I guess we get this when we go to the south of France, the explosion of the sun. Yes?
No, you're quite right. I mean, he's still in the north. He's still a painter of the north, and the whole that revelation of color equals light equals sun, and from the south, that's yet to come.
There is one comparison we want to make, though, here. The hills of Montmartre with Stone Quarry, in contrast to this painting.
When Van Gogh first comes to Paris, he's still painting as if he's still in Holland. And the early pictures from Paris have that somber, restrained palette. And if you compare the Stone Quarry to this, you're going from, it's like from night to day, from dark to light. And it's rather nice that in the exhibition you could see almost side by side these 2 examples to bring through that effect of the new light and the new color in his work.
As we go into the next room and the next room, getting to what everybody knows most about, which is the south of France and a bout with illness and in the end of his life, we will go through a room here at the National Gallery which is sort of dedicated to the Japanese influence. I want you to tell me about that, because I've always read about it and I've never quite understood it. But let's go through that room on our way to the south of France. Here we go. So we're leaving Paris and we're on our way down to the south of France, but I just want to take one moment to talk about Japanese art and its influence on Van Gogh. Why Japanese art?
Well, in some ways it was an artistic thing. Here was a type of art which was so utterly fresh. Van Gogh, like so many other artists, had the idea that he'd seen everything under the sun in Western European painting. And then the exposure to these wonderful, brightly colored prints was like something completely new. And yet, they're so simple, so direct, astonishingly clear, that he wanted to be able to paint like that. Almost a childlike simplicity, you could say.
Take a look at the courtesan and tell me what you see there.
Well, this is rather fascinating because, on the one hand, it's a copy after a Japanese print, but on the other hand, he's made something completely new out of it. What he did, in fact, was he borrowed the central motif of the courtesan. He's taken that from the cover of a Paris magazine, Paris Illustré. He made a tracing of that and superimposed it onto his canvas. And then around the edges of that, and this is when it starts to get individual and in some ways odd, he's put that flat print against a kind of an open background, a spatial background with details in such as the bamboo and the lily pads. And he's taken the little frog in the foreground, that's come from a completely different Japanese print, and so has the crane in the background. And there's some odd allusions going on here, because the word in French for a crane and the word in French for a frog were both common slang terms for prostitutes. So together with the courtesan, he's making it into in some ways, it's Van Gogh's attempt to make a kind of a sophisticated urban joke based on the print.
He never saw the original print, which inspired the painting.
Well, that's right. We have in the Van Gogh Museum, we actually have Van Gogh's collection of Japanese prints, some 400 of them. and he did use some of those as basis for his pictures. In this case, the original print by Eisen is one that isn't in the collection, so we assume, didn't know it.
Let me switch you all the way over here. This is Still Life with Lemon's 1887. What's interesting is not only the painting, which I want you to talk about, but also the frame.
Like other artists of this time, Van Gogh had very clear ideas about the way he wanted to present his pictures. He was thinking quite carefully about different types of frame, different types of molding, different types of wood. But also, crucially, he was thinking about the colors. And of course, the frame is the very important medium between the picture and its surroundings. And he wanted to experiment with colored frames. And this is one that he's painted himself. And of course, it has to be. It's that wonderful bright yellow. And it just brings the whole picture to life.
How does his Still Life compare with, say, Cézanne, a painter that you're also an expert about?
Well, of course, Cézanne one thinks of, above all, with that close, minute scrutiny of the forms. And you associate him, I suppose, with almost a sense of stillness when he paints a subject like this. Look at this picture and the extraordinary dynamism in the brushwork, how the brushstrokes seem to leap around the forms. And you talk about still life, and in French, nature morte. There's nothing dead about this picture. There's nothing inanimate about those objects. They could almost still be living on the living fruit on the trees.
This is one of the last paintings in Paris.
That's right. And rather nicely, it carries a dedication to his brother Theo in the corner, which adds that nice personal touch.
As we go into the next room, we begin to see the things that, for most Americans and most people around the world, he's identified for. Self-portraits, of course, but we're beginning to see in Arles his painting in 1888 with color, with the sun. He's doing what? He's coming to define himself, what he's going to be.
I think that's right. We're seeing signs of the growing confidence here in this yellow still life that we've just been looking at. But away from Paris and away from the factionalism, away from all those sometimes confusing influences, the road ahead becomes clear, one could say, and he knows what he has to do. And the style comes right, the technique comes right, and the ideas come together. And there's this extraordinary period of creativity in the summer of 1888.
The most important painting in that room is what?
It has to be The Harvest, a picture which he himself thought of as one of his greatest pictures.
Let's take a look at The Harvest. What amazes me about him is the sense of the evolution from he goes from one place to the other. From Paris now. Sure. Okay. Here we are, The Harvest, 1888. He's clearly confident.
That's right. I think that's one of the first things one would notice about the picture. We've been looking at pictures where we've pointed out perhaps a certain unsureness in the drawing, maybe a more tentative handling of paint, or maybe a design that wasn't in some way convincing or whatever.
And an evolution. I mean, you can see him evolving to this, and he's clearly here now with his full command of color and the strokes he wants to use, and his sense of how he can communicate what he feels.
That's right. I mean, this is an artist who is, as you say, in command of his means. We've had through the years in Holland and through the period in Paris, we've had an artist who's very much learning, searching, experimenting. He's got those means now, and he's at the height of his powers. There's a real feeling of confidence now that he's in the south of France. And I think along with that is the fact that he knows now also the type of subject which he wants to paint. And he does a whole series of pictures through the early summer and the midsummer of 1888, based on the cycles of nature. And here we have the harvest, a theme which he comes back to time and again.
Where did that come from? Was that because he'd been thinking a lot about life and death, or what?
It is a consistent thread in his work. The way that, in a sense, you could say that a conventional idea of religion, of Christianity, is replaced in Van Gogh by more a belief in the continuity of nature, and that what he describes as something up there, is the expression he uses to describe a sense of divinity, that is animating nature and contributing to this sense of birth, growth, renewal, and death.
What I love about this, by the way, he loved this painting.
Yes, he describes it in a letter as one of his best yet.
Best yet.
Best yet. He's clearly proud of what he's achieved. And as I say, it has this sense of optimism. We feel that he's arrived at something.
What I like about it is so much is going on. I mean, there is such detail. Sky at the top, you got blue, yellows in the middle, greens up close. You got something here. Help me understand what's happening and why this painting is so recognizable and so extraordinary.
Yes. Well, first of all, I think you have that wonderful breadth and depth. He clearly loved this view across the plain, where you're looking into the distance to the foothills in the background, and as he leads your eye almost step by step through the composition. First of all, you start with the texture here of the corn growing in the foreground, through this wonderful pictorial device for the paling of the fences with those big spiky brushstrokes. Yet again into another zone there where the bushes where the people are working, and behind it the cart. Step by step, gradually taking you through, almost in a linear way, through the little carts and the buildings, through to the distance. And as I describe it, you would think, this is a fussy picture this man's talking about. But it's not. It's in one blow. It's like it's the equivalent of the visual experience. You're taking in so much all in one go.
What about color here?
Well, yes. I mean, color here is being orchestrated again with the confidence that really defines this period. You might think, oh, no, I associate Van Gogh with really bright, explosive colors. Yet this is in some ways a little bit muted. Yeah. But it's the way that he's playing off one color against another to get the most out of it. That kind of whole orchestration of a range of colors. It's now incredibly sophisticated for all the seeming naivety of the picture.
The judgment of critics, scholars, museum directors, curators would be that this is a masterpiece.
It's one of to put it into a wider context, I think you'd have to say it's one of a series of masterpieces from that summer period. It has to be the height of his career, the crest, if you like, this period in Arles. He is, for example, for the first time talking about exhibiting his works, but typically he says, well, I need to get together some 30 works like this and then I'd have an exhibition. But yes, it has to be one of the greats.
The keynote of this exhibition is that 70 of the 72 paintings come from your museum. Right. So we have Van Gogh's Van Goghs. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Van Gogh that you see at your museum when it's not under construction, two from the permanent collection here at the National Gallery. Having said that, also here in this room is Field with Flowers near Arles, also Wheatfield. Tell me about fishing boat on the beach at Saint Maurice de la Mer. Tell me about some of those. Start with fishing boat on the beach.
Yeah. Well, again, in this glorious period in the summer, Van Gogh took some time out to go to the coast. At Arles, you're quite a little bit inland, but he went to the coast to Saint-Marie, and he took 3 canvases with him and some paper for drawing. And he only painted stayed a short period of time, less than a week. But he found a whole new range of motifs. We saw him painting the stormy sea at the beach by the Hague right at the beginning. But here the sea is much more benign. It's much more this wonderful decorative blue. But I think what particularly attracted him were the boats which have been pulled up onto the beach. And it's an extraordinarily intricate piece of drawing. With these blocked in with these wonderful colors, like the colors of the painted wooden boats. But he pulls it off, and again, it's a sign of this artist who's a master of
and coming into full command of all of his faculties and all of his genius and artistry. Speak to me about the draftsmanship.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the sides of Van Gogh that you perhaps don't see in this exhibition is Van Gogh the draftsman.
Yes.
In the Van Gogh Museum, we have over 500 drawings by the artist. That's almost half of the drawings that he made. And like many other artists, he became more proficient earlier in drawing than he did in painting. But there's always this kind of link between drawing and painting in Van Gogh. The one goes with the other. And at this time in Arles, for example, he was producing these wonderful drawings with reed pen and ink, making these wonderful, almost Japanese-like marks across the paper. And some of that graphic exploration feeds into the paintings because, of course, you get them trying to imitate effects in paint of what he's been achieving in his drawings. But he is a superb draftsman. He has an eye for extracting the essence of a subject and setting it out there in a very forceful way on paper.
In the next room, a room that I really look forward to, as we talk about Van Gogh, this is a picture that we would recognize. The self-portrait is a picture we'll recognize. In the next room is the Yellow House, where he hoped to gather all the artists and in a sense, celebrate the act of creating art. But it's also the bedroom, another famous Van Gogh. Let's take a look at that. Well, here is the bedroom, which everybody, I think, identifies as one of those singular visions about Van Gogh. He wrote Theo and he said, "It's just simply my bedroom, only here color is to do everything, and giving by simplification a grander style to things is to be suggestive here of rest or of sleep in general. In a word, looking at the picture ought to rest the brain, or rather the imagination." Tell me about this painting.
Well, I think the quote you just read out tells us quite a lot. Again, if one was to describe this picture, it sounds deadly ordinary.
Yes.
A bed, some chairs, a table, a window. And it is quite simply his bedroom, as he says. It was part of a wider decorative scheme that he had in mind for the Yellow House. He wanted these rooms to be filled with his own colourful paintings, and he was linking them through the sunflowers. The famous sunflowers, for example, was to be part of that decorative cycle. But anyway, if one describes it, it's very ordinary. But first of all, you have the sophistication of the way that he's able to describe objects now. I mean, the way, for example, that he uses that paint to convey the idea of wood. The sort of granular texture of the paint to conjure up that bed. Then the accumulation of the details, the hat balanced up there on the peg, this drape down here from the door. Lovely details such as the light filtering through the green shutters, flooding into the room. So in that sense, you think, okay, it's a description of the bedroom. But as that quote suggests, he's thinking not just in terms of color and what it can do to describe objects, everyday objects, but he's thinking of the way that colors can be used and combinations of colors can be used in a more evocative way. And so this whole idea of this potential symbolism of color is beginning to become more important for him.
Now here's where I'm confused a little bit. He very much would paint something and take lots of liberty, lots of liberty in his paintings, correct?
That's right.
He always said, I'm not about photographing.
That's right.
I'm not about direct impressions.
Yes.
What we have here is an exact replica of his bedroom, except the colors may be different or something, I don't know.
You wouldn't want to sleep a night in that bed. You wouldn't get a wink of sleep in that bed.
So it wasn't these colors.
No. I think the point is, in some ways, you can describe Van Gogh as a realist artist, an artist who is depicting what he sees. He's certainly basing his paintings on the world around him, and that's what he wants to do. But in another sense, he's filtering his impressions, filtering those perceptions through his temperament, and that's what he wants to do. He wants to give his idea of the world, his view of the world, filtered through his own very powerful, very heightened emotions. And in that sense, he takes liberties, of course. He plays with the drawing, he exaggerates the form. As we've said, that bed would be uncomfortable. This bed end's huge in comparison to the rest. That's a tiny chair. And so, of course, these liberties with the drawing, he takes them to make for expressive ends, really. And the same goes for color. Exaggerated, heightened, simplified.
And also you see using two shades of the same color to contrast the two, or to accentuate one.
That's right. He's very much setting colors against each other, playing with primary and complementary colors to really make them zing against one another.
How great is Vincent van Gogh as a colorist?
It has to be the central element of his expressive means, if you like. On the one hand, you can say that he's intuitively brilliant as a colorist, that he just has an instinct for focusing on these combinations, these nuances of color. But on the other hand, he studied it. He read color theory. He read what these writers were saying about how you juxtapose colors. He looked hard at what other artists were doing. So he's a great colorist because he's instinctive, but also because he studied. So a paradox.
His favorite color, yellow seems to be prominent for him. Mm-hmm. I mean, he fell in love with yellow.
Mm-hmm. Yellow is important. It's a color which, in a way, evokes sunlight. It's a very direct equation, yellow sun. But also he does impose levels of meaning or layers of meaning on this. And he talks, for example, in one of the letters about yellow being the color of friendship, which is not an idea that you and I would automatically associate with it. So beyond the purely descriptive, he's, as I say, looking to color to evoke sometimes rather abstract ideas.
Let me take you to a very different painting, the Yellow House. This room was in that house, the Yellow House. But this is almost, the dark blue sky, the house, certain sense of architecture. What else?
Well, we talked about Van Gogh's ambitions as a portraitist.
Yes.
And in a way, this is a portrait of a house.
Yes.
This is where he wanted to live. This is where he wanted to set up this artist colony, this studio of the South in the Yellow House. It's the room with the green shutters. And okay, the building was perhaps in this yellowing color that one associates with with architecture in Arles and in Provence. But that is quite some yellow. And look at the sky. That kind of, that seems to be like a night sky.
Yeah, it does.
So he's set this brightly, almost luridly colored house against this dark midnight sky. So the picture does take on this quality almost of a hallucination.
We go into the next room, and I guess there we go to Remy, St. Remy.
That's right.
And where he's in the hospital.
That's right.
And we see wheat field with a reaper, also almond blossom, which was a celebration moment after the birth of Theo's son, Vincent. Let's go into that room and take a look and see what we see in there. We can slide by here. Okay. We're now in the last year or so of his life and some of the more famous paintings, and this is clearly one, Wheatfield with a Reaper. Before we talk about this and what he said about it, put me in St. Remy and what's going on.
Well, after the famous incident with Gauguin and when he cut off part of his left earlobe.
The famous incident, he claimed that, Gauguin claimed that he tried to do it. There's some question about that, but then he went and cut off his own.
That's right. After that breakdown, if you like, in the spring, the following spring, Van Gogh voluntarily committed himself to this asylum at Saint-Remy, which is near Arles. In the beginning, he wasn't allowed to paint, but gradually he was, and first of all in the grounds of the asylum itself, and then was able to wander a bit more freely. But the view that we have here is more or less the same view that Van Gogh had from the window in the asylum. So he was looking out every day at this view. He saw the sun rising above those hills in the background, and he painted the same view right through the season. He painted it when the corn was still green and young. He painted it as it matured and became yellow. And here he's painting it with the reaper harvesting.
He says in a letter to his brother Theo, "I see in this reaper the image of death in the sense that humanity might be the wheat he is reaping. But there's nothing sad in this death. It goes its way in broad daylight with the sun flooding everywhere, everything with a light of pure gold. Is he beginning to think about death?
Well, I think one has to put it into the context of what we were talking about before, this interest in the cycle of nature. And as he says in that quote, it is about death in that sense, but he doesn't see it as a negative thing. He sees it as a positive thing. Just as in the harvest, the wheat will be cut down, but it's going to be sown again and it will grow again.
Remember, he's 36 years old now. Tell me what we see that's different, if at all, about the talent expressed here or the way he uses the talent.
Mm-hmm. Well, in a way, after the breakdown in Arles, there is a sort of period of crisis, if you like, and the colouring changes again. The way that he handles paint, that also changes. This picture, in some ways, is a bit of an exception because you're going back to the strength and the vibrancy of the colour of the Arles period, and it's flooded with this yellow. And also, when you look at the texture of that wheat, he has found a very convincing equivalent in paint for the movement of those stalks of wheat and the wind rustling through. And as that quote that you read suggests, this is in a way a picture which seems to carry quite a heavy symbolic burden, rather more perhaps than some of the other pictures of this view. And he's, just as he painted many canvases of people sowing, so this is the other end of the cycle.
Right.
This is the
reaping the harvest.
Reaping the harvest.
Across this gallery is almond blossom, painted. What's the context of the painting before we talk about the painting itself?
Well, that was painted very early in 1890 to celebrate the birth of his nephew, Theo, and Theo's wife had a baby boy who was to become named Vincent after his uncle, Vincent the painter. Yeah. It just shows that at this most difficult time, when he was having these attacks, when he was uncertain about his future, uncertain what was going to happen to him.
Because of the illness? Because
of his illness, because of the fact that he was increasing financial burden, if you like, on his brother. He could still paint this picture which expresses this wonderful sense of optimism and confidence and vitality. And it's really, with the blossom, an image of birth and renewal, so celebrating the coming of this child. And what is, of course, for us at the Van Gogh Museum of special significance of this picture is that that little baby would grow up to become the founder of our museum.
What's interesting about the Van Gogh family, a number of them are coming here for the opening of this exhibition. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Well, of course, the Van Gogh family take an interest in the collection still. The pictures that are here all belong to the Van Gogh Foundation, which is on which the family are represented. So in a way, they still fulfill a role as guardians of the collection.
Let's go in the next room and see wheat fields with crows painted just before he died. Here it is. This is Wheat Field with Crows, one of the last paintings, if not the last. Most people don't think it's the last. It clearly reflects something. He said in a letter to Theo, "There are vast fields of wheat under troubled skies, and I did not have to go out of my way to try to express sadness and extreme loneliness." Tell me about this painting, where he is in his life and what's he going through. Within weeks, he ends his life.
A lot of people have looked at this picture and seen it as a very pessimistic image. You associate it with the artist's suicide, and you look at the picture and you see, for example, the three pathways that seem to diverge. The pathway in the middle here, which seems to cut off and not lead anywhere. They look at the color of the corn with that flash of sunlight, which seems to suggest something temporary. And they look at those, above all, they look at those dark birds with their sort of flapping wings, which seems to be associated with death. I don't know. I think if one forgets for a moment that idea that this could be one of his last pictures and sees it against what we've been looking at through the exhibition, this whole idea of nature as an ongoing cycle, I think you could turn it around and say that this is actually a very positive picture, that it is a picture which is bursting with energy and life, which is filled with the vitality of the growing corn. And sure, yeah, you have this very dark sky, but I think in a way, if we think right back to that very first picture of the beach at near The Hague, you have that same sense of nature as being a productive thing, that's where you make your living from, but also the sense that at the same time it could be overwhelming. And so it's this combination of joy and sorrow, this what he talks about in that quote you read out. He talks about loneliness and sorrow, but at the same time, in the very same letter, he talks about, and this conveys the forces of health and regeneration that I see in the countryside.
Within 2 weeks, he went out into a wheat field with a gun. We don't know where he got the gun, I don't think, do we?
No.
He shot himself, not in the heart, but in the stomach, which suggested he just wanted to send a message or he wanted to cry out in pain. For 2 days, he stayed alive. His brother came to see him, and then he died. 70 works from the Van Gogh Museum are here. What do you hope people come away with in this extraordinary reflection of one of the great artists of certainly that century, if not other centuries?
I think above all, and this is what we want to do at the Van Gogh Museum, is to put the emphasis on the art rather than on the man, on the biography. I think it's important to know the story, it's important to know how they impinge on the art, but at the same time there's always that threat that the biography will take over, so that when you're looking at a picture like this, all you can think of is the artist's suicide. I think in a way you've got to start with the picture itself, start with your reaction to it, think of it as this artist who's wanting to express so forcefully his emotions, his engagement with the outside world, and then move outwards, like the ripples in a pond when you throw the pebble in. Move outwards to the biography and to the wider context of his times.
Go ahead.
Look at the pictures.
Okay, if you just look at the pictures, what do you come away with? Where is Vincent van Gogh in this broad spectrum of art?
I think there are three things which make Van Gogh such a memorable and powerful artist. We've talked a lot about the color and that fantastic sense of color. I'd put alongside that his ability to create these wonderfully memorable compositions. However complicated the subject is, it's this ability to extract something simple, direct, and memorable, like an image like this. And then thirdly, I think there's this extraordinary appeal in the subjects that he chooses. Ordinary subjects, everyday scenes, yet he animates them with a sense of the extraordinary. And I think that's the key, the color, the compositions, and what lies behind the surfaces.
I would add one thing, the intensity and the power of his ability to reflect the emotion that he feels about what he sees.
I think I'm going to let you have the last word on that.
Thank you, John. I know you have to go catch a plane. It's a pleasure to go on this journey through the life and the work and the art of Vincent van Gogh. Thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Have a good flight back to Amsterdam.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My thanks to John Leighton, the director of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, but also we want to thank all the people at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. Van Gogh's on exhibit from October 4th, 1998 to January 3rd, 1999. Then it travels to Los Angeles and the L.A. County Museum of Art. It is an extraordinary exhibition of the work of one of the world's great artists, Vincent van Gogh. We thank you for joining us. See you next time.